Hey, we're going to wrap up our discussion on domestic policies in Adolf Hitler's Germany today, starting with the Hitler Youth and the BDM, or the League of German Maidens. The Hitler Youth was an organization that actually began in the 1920s in the very early Nazi Party as a way to develop future party members. It was just one of many youth organizations that existed in Germany. But by 1936, with the Nazi regime in control, it would become Germany's only boys' organization, a version of the Boy Scouts, essentially, with an emphasis on the values of National Socialism, loyalty to the state, and absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler. There was a focus on physical activities and wellness and outdoor life. And essentially, the Nazi youth, or the Hitler Youth, was training future Nazi party members, future soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, and future members of the SS. For young women, the League of German Maidens, or the BDM, was their counterpart to the boys' Hitler Youth. And this emphasized development of the skills young women in Nazi Germany needed to support the Nazi vision of womanhood and the patriarchal society in Germany. Now, these organizations, particularly the Hitler Youth, was originally voluntary, but by 1939, membership became compulsory. Now, women in Nazi Germany would face a similar role to women in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. The role for German women was purely domestic under Adolf Hitler's vision. The government would emphasize the value of motherhood and, in fact, reward motherhood. Women were encouraged to give up work, to leave the workplace, because as that had been growing in the 1920s under the Weimar regime, and become mothers for the benefit of the state and growing the future German population. Abortion was made illegal. Financial rewards were given to marriages and for having children. Women that had many children could earn an award from the German state called the Cross of Honor for the German Mother. And this was if you had 4 or more children. This followed a long tradition in the German state of Kinder, Küche, and Kirche, the children, kitchen, and the church. These traditional ideals of the role of women in Germany, although under Nazi Germany, the church would be de-emphasized. War needs, however, especially after 1942, when the war started to turn against Germany, war needs would push women back into the industrial workforce and away from this purely domestic lifestyle. Now, with regard to the treatment of minorities in Nazi Germany, Nazi Aryanism, this notion of racial purity that was central to Nazi ideology, led all of those that did not fit in this model of a supposed German racial purity test to be expendable. As early as 1933, as Adolf Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany, a law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was passed, which required forced sterilization of those that suffered from conditions like epilepsy, deafness, and blindness. This followed a wider eugenics movement that was relatively notable during this early 20th century, but Germany goes farther than anybody else in actually employing policies of the eugenics movement for their state. By 1939, Adolf Hitler will issue an order for what was known as Action T4, which called for euthanasia, or the forced killing of those deemed defective by the Nazi regime. People suffering from physical or mental disorders were marked for death, essentially, in Nazi Germany. Over 70,000 people were killed under this program. Jews only made up 1% of the German population, but they were the largest target of German Nazi propaganda during the Nazi regime. Now, this persecution of Jews went in stages and escalated over time. In 1933, with the rise of Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany, open harassment and violence against Jews on the street was permitted. The law was not stopping it. Jews were barred from civil service jobs in the government and many professional jobs like lawyers. By 1935, the Nuremberg race laws took away all legal and civil rights from Jews. Marriage between Jews and non-Jews was forbidden. Jews lost full citizenship in Germany, and one was considered Jewish based on these Nuremberg laws if 3 out of their 4 grandparents were Jewish. Stages of this persecution continued by 1938, as Jewish doctors would be forbidden from practice. Jewish businesses were forced to close. Jewish students were removed from schools and universities. Curfews for Jews began to be implemented. Polish Jews were expelled from the German state if they were legal residents prior. And plans for the forced removal of all German Jews began to be discussed. Now, in November of 1938, Kristallnacht, this German-wide pogrom or attack against the Jewish population, was begun following the assassination of a German diplomat in France by a German Polish Jew. Now, this was a real attack. This was not a fabrication. However, the Kristallnacht reaction to it was only using that assassination as a pretext for attacks and violence that were long desired by Nazi Germany. Synagogues were destroyed. Jewish shops were destroyed. Over 100 Jews in Germany were killed. Thousands were sent to concentration camps on Kristallnacht. By 1942, the war begins. By 1939, with the start of the war, Adolf Hitler would call for the German people to avenge the loss from World War I. And remember that Adolf Hitler had long blamed that defeat in World War I on the Jews within the German government. With the start of this new war, Hitler called for the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In the early years of the war, this is from 1939 to 1942, this is when the war is going well for Germany. They're expanding, they're seeing victories, and they're pushing deeper into Eastern Europe. June of 1941, recall that the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. Deportation and the murder of Jews would follow wherever the German army went. Einsatzgruppen, or special units of the SS, would follow the German Wehrmacht into occupied Europe, and they were tasked with the organization and ultimately murder of hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jews. In 1942, this persecution and murder of the Jews would be more systematized with following the Wannsee Conference, a meeting of Nazi Party and German leadership where, quote, the final solution to what they called the Jewish problem was scripted, the call for all European Jews to be murdered. This would follow with deportation to labor camps, where the Jewish prisoners would be forced to work until they succumbed to death, or immediate killing for those that were not able to work. Women and their children, elderly, they were suffering immediate execution. From 1942 to 1945, this is what we refer to as the Holocaust, where special concentration camps or death camps were constructed in Poland.